Hey, it's Tim here. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to publish a data source to Tableau Server. This is part 2 of a beginner's tutorial for Tableau Server and Tableau Online. And in last week's video, we got a comment on the video essentially asking to do a video on publishing data sources up to Tableau Server and Tableau Online. Now, there's also this small quirk here. Today, I'm only going to cover how to do this from Tableau Desktop. Tableau Prep can also publish data sources up to Tableau Server or Tableau Online. So I'm not going to cover that in this video. This will be another video that I'll do at some other time. But today we're just going to be using Tableau Desktop. You can also do this through web authoring, but the interface is slightly different. So again, I'll maybe make a separate video for that. But let's get stuck in. Okay, so in front of me, I have Tableau Desktop open, and I've actually gone ahead and done some sort of setup. Now, I'm not able to share the data sources that I'm using today with you. So this is going to be one of those videos where you just watch along and you walk through the mechanics as I show them to you on screen. Now, what I've done is I've already set up this test workbook. I'm actually in the workbook already. And if I click on the Tableau logo here on the top, you can see that I'm able to go right through into the view and I'm able to start using the workbook. Now, this workbook is actually connected to two data sources. You can see them here on the top left. I've got something called Fivetran Audit, which is like an audit table that comes from a system I use to push YouTube and Google Analytics data into Snowflake. That is essentially an audit table that tells me how many rows it's written to the database. The next data source is a Google Analytics data source. It's not actually very good, but in essence, it allows me to look at the data coming from Google Analytics. Again, this has been generated by Fivetran and is being pushed into Snowflake, and I'm connected to it. But you'll notice that it's actually set up as an extract. So they're both connected to the same database, but one is set up as an extract and one is set up as a live connection. Essentially, I want to show you the difference between publishing both. Okay, so the first question is probably to cover why would you publish a data source up to Tableau Server or Tableau Online? Well, the first one is you might want to collaborate. You might want to work with other people on the same data source. And so what you want to do is share your data source with other people and have it shared in a centralized place where you get the governance and structure that Tableau Server offers and makes it available to a group of people or maybe just another individual. Whatever you're trying to do, if you want to share it, you're going to need to publish a data source to make that easy to work with. Now, the other thing you might want to do is centralize database access and driver management. One of the quirks with connecting to data sources, if you have to send people details of how to connect to a data source, essentially that can get a bit tedious and you can have people sort of typing in usernames and passwords all over the place. One of the benefits of publishing up a data source is you can actually almost delegate access to a database through a centralized embedded password. And by that, other people can connect to it and access the data they need. Or you might decide to publish up a data set that is an extract, which we've got here. And what you want to do is set that data source to refresh on a schedule and then let people connect to that data source separate from that database connection. So essentially using Tableau Server to schedule the update of that data source. And then you're also using Tableau Server to give you some structure and governance around the data source. Okay. The very last one, which is not as commonly sort of referenced, is the fact that you might want to, be mobile. Once you publish up a data source to Tableau Server or Tableau Online, you can access it from any machine, including web edit. So in case you're stuck and you only got an iPad, you can even pull up a browser and start working with the data source if the data source is published. If it's not, then you're going to need to get hold of Tableau Desktop or some tool that can publish the data source. And with web edit, you can also create data sources now, which is a great sort of addition. But nonetheless, it just adds a little bit of mobility. So those are the three key reasons why you might want to publish up a data source. The main reason by far is the fact that once you standardize a bunch of settings into the data source, you're actually able to publish this up and then people are able to take advantage of that. In 2021.3, there's also some benefits of being able to add things like descriptions to these published data sources. So I'll go into the very basic setup today, and in another video, I'll cover those benefits for the data catalog as well. So here you can see I've got two data sources. The first one I'm going to publish up is actually going to be my live connection. You can see that I've got it here in my workbook, and if I actually go to this visualization, you can see that it's actually connected to this data set. Now, one thing you tend to do when you're publishing up from Tableau Desktop is you tend to validate what data is actually in there. And you might need to do some prep or some cleanup to the data source. So what I might decide to do is I might decide to rename this field. It's got an underscore, so it's sort of breaking the naming structure that I'm sort of used to. So I'll just go and replace the underscore and 5 and set that up to that. Now, everything else, there's not really much to change here. All the data structure and everything is pretty good. If I go and grab this update ID, let's just see if it's text. It's actually quite a complicated ID. Essentially, this is the ID for the specific update task that's running. So there's nothing we can do to that. What we might decide to do is split this out. For whatever reason, I might decide to run a data operation on this. It doesn't necessarily make sense, but I'm just going to run the split function on this. And we're going to ask it to use a hyphen. And we're going to actually ask it to just split out everything. So click OK. And you will see that it automatically figures out that there's 5 splits there. And it does that for me. And now I have the individual parts of the split. And I can just go and bring out, let's say, part 3 of the split. And you'll see that it has that structure there. So now that that's done, I've essentially created some calculation. I've done a little bit of data prep to this. And what I want to do is now publish this up as is. Okay, so let's go ahead and right click on this live connection. And you'll see that I have the option to publish this up to server. Now, there's a couple of things to bear in mind here. This is a live connection. So you might be asking, well, what is it actually publishing up to Tableau Server? Well, if you've watched my video on Tableau file types, you'll know that you can actually save this as a saved data source. Essentially, this becomes a TDS. A TDS is essentially just a file that contains the connection details for a database. Essentially tells you what the database is, the username and the password, and any sort of metadata that you've created about the data source. And it saves it in a specific place on your computer. When you publish this up to Tableau Server or Tableau Online, you're essentially pushing this up to the Tableau Server, and then it's using that information to create the connection in Tableau Server and Tableau Online when someone connects to it. So let's go ahead and select this Publish to Server option, and you'll see that I get an option here for Tableau Online. If you use Tableau Server, you'd actually go in and just type your connection information straight away. Now I'm going to connect to Tableau Online. And in this particular setup, it's actually going to ask me to log into my Tableau server. So I'll go ahead and type my password and hit sign in. And once I've signed in, it will actually load a window and it will ask me where I want to publish this particular data source. Just give it a second, you'll see the window pop up. Here it is on the screen. So now I have this little pop-up, I can move it around and notice that it just says publish data source to Tableau Online. And it's gone and got some presets for this data source. And it's getting it from the default folder here in my Tableau Online setup. Now, actually, what I did before this video is I created a project on Tableau Online called Publish Data Sources. And that's where I'm actually going to put this data source. I'm going to put all of them there. And you can see that it's given the name that I selected up here in the connection. So you can see the 5-tran audit is over here on the top left. But nonetheless, everything is pretty much good to go. And what I can now do is I can actually go down through these settings. Now, I'll go through this very slowly. The first one is the project, the name of the connection, and the description. I can give this a description, and it helps to give a description for metadata purposes. So I'll call this my 5-tran audit table. Okay, and now that I've done that, I can go ahead and add tags. Now, tags are sort of an interesting thing. You can place them across all different types of content and they sort of persist. It's a nice way of sort of grouping content without having to put them in folders. But I'm not going to, I'll add one here so you can see what it means. So I'll call this data source, maybe data source. So I can go and find all my data sources very easily. So you can see that that data source tag is added. Now, the next thing is the permissions. Now, at the moment, it's set to the same as the project. So when I publish this up, it's going to inherit the permissions that are currently in the project. That's normally a good thing to do. If I want to edit those, though, I can go in here and edit them myself by clicking add, and I get an interface that allows me to add the permissions that have been set up. If you haven't done so already, check out the previous video that I just recorded on permissions to get more context. Essentially, this interface allows you to control those settings from Tableau Desktop. Now, the thing here is if you've locked the project permissions to the project, this is not going to really work. It will just tell you, hey, look, the project permissions have been set to this. And if you were to set the permissions at this level and maybe move it into that folder or something, it would automatically inherit those project permissions. So don't worry too much about this, but you can see here that I've got different groups. I'm going to leave everything as default, but by all means, if you want to play around with these permissions, be very careful how you do this, because sometimes you can make it very difficult, because this interface is not as good as doing it on Tableau Server or Tableau Online, as I showed in my previous video. But you've also got some presets here if you want to start from a decent sort of foundation. So if you want to give, for example, the publish template for this particular setting, you'll see that it gives people the ability to view, connect, download, and overwrite this data source. And then it doesn't have any settings for moving, deleting, and setting the permissions. And it does allow people to save as, okay? And it gives this to all users. You can see that the group here, all users, is selected. And that's why this interface is sort of weird, because it's not obvious that what you select here is actually what's controlling the permissions. As you see, as I click through these, you can see the permissions do slightly change. So be super careful how you set this up. But I'm actually going to hit cancel and go back to this simple interface and just carry on. Now, the authentication here is selected, and it's saying prompt the user. And what this will mean is that when someone goes to try and use this connection, it's actually going to ask them for a username and password. So it's going to send up the details of the database, but it's going to extract the username and the password. If I click edit, I can actually see that I get the information about the database. So I get that I get the name, I get the connection, the authentication. What I could do is I could embed the password. So in this particular instance, I'd be embedding my individual password in this use case. This is okay because I'm on my own Tableau Online instance, so I'm going to be the only one using it. I can also do a few things and set this up, but essentially for now, I'm going to leave this as is. I don't get the option to extract because, of course, this is a live connection, so it's not going to have that setting there. Now, if I go down here, you see that I have more options, and it will ask me if I want to update the workbook to use the publish data source. Now, if you tick this, what will happen is as soon as you hit publish, it would essentially change the connection that we've got set up here on the top left, 5-try and audit, and replace it with the published data source. Okay, so I won't do that for this first attempt. So just to show you what that looks like, then I'll duplicate this connection and publish the second one, and you can see what's going on. So let me untick that box, and now you're pretty much ready to go. At the bottom, you'll see this option here. Tableau Online will temporarily access the credentials provided to confirm it can maintain a live data connection. So it's basically telling you, hey, I'm going to make a call to the database just to make sure that I can keep this connection up wherever you're going to publish me. And essentially when I hit publish, it will kick off the process. And in this particular case, it should open up a browser tab. It has in fact opened up a browser tab on my other machine. I'll bring it over here. And here's the window. So you can see that it gives us a successful completion, and you can see that it's done. You can adjust the permissions and other information for this data source. Now that it's done, you get the standard interface and setup that you have for data sources in Tableau Online or Tableau Server. And not only that, you can see that I have all the fields that I created. And if I hover over them, you can actually see the formula that was used to create them. And also, if I go to this 5-tran synced folder, you'll see that everything is sort of nicely set up. It's persisted the names that I had, and we're pretty much good to go. Now, I can obviously explore some of this other detail. You can see here that it's a live connection. It's got the name of the database. And if I hit these 3 dots, I can go into edit connection, and you'll see that it actually gives me the ability to double check and make sure the connection is working correctly. I'll just show you how that looks like very, very briefly. I'll just grab my password here off screen and go in and paste that and hit test connection. And you'll see that I'm actually able to test the connection live on the server and make sure everything is working correctly. Now that I've done that, I can obviously click save, and it will just persist that. So this is a great place to come if the database credentials change and you realize that something's not working. But for now, we're going to leave that as is. The other thing I can do is see any connected workbooks. The connected workbooks only can exist once you actually start building something with it. And then if I go to the next tab, you can see that this lineage tab already has some information about the lineage of this data source. It essentially just shows me on the right-hand side the database that it came from, the tables that it's using. So you can see this 5-tran audit table is what it's using from that database. And then it's obviously got the specific data source, and everything that's sort of in here has been described very nicely. And what we can do is if you click on each of these, it actually gives you a more detailed pop-up window where you can start to change how things work. Now, what I can do is I can edit the description here. So I can say this field was created in desktop, okay, and hit save. And now that that's done, everything is nicely saved and it's persisted. And now when I go and look at this description, you'll see that it's available there. If I go back and close this, go back to Ask Data, and then I just start looking at the fields. If I hover over this particular view when it loads up, This is actually the default view that it loads up on. When I go to this update split there, you'll see the description is now persisted. This field was created in Desktop and that's now named. Now, in order to use ASK data, that requires you to create a lens. But nonetheless, we're pretty much good to go. This is everything we need to do for this data source. There's nothing to change in terms of extracts because it's a live connection. If I want to use this, I can just go ahead, create a new workbook. And I'm doing this in Web Edit just to show you this capability. And boom, our data source is ready to go. It has this nice Tableau icon. And I can, of course, just start using this. So I can go ahead and get the number of rows. And we can also go and get the start date. And we can just start visualizing this exactly as we did before. At the moment, it's aggregated to the year. Let's get that down to the day. And you can see a nice little line chart. And of course, what I can do is I can bring the start date into the filters. And I'm going to filter out a specific set of months because the first month is always weird because it does an initial sync in that month. And what I'll do is I'll exclude that month and then we'll just have a normal sort of set of data. So now you can see exact same information that I had in my chart. And if I set it to bar chart and I swap back to Tableau, you'll see that it's basically the same chart that I've connected. Now the difference is I've done it using the published data source. The thing to be aware of is, of course, if it's a live connection, as this is, every time you're making a change, it's making a call to the database. So because it's a live published connection, the user doesn't necessarily know that it's an extract or not. So basically, they can't differentiate what kind of connection is sitting in the background. All they know is that they have a connection to the database. If they were to go back to this particular page and they had access to see this information, they would be able to see that there's actually a live connection. So everything a user does is actually making a call back to the database. And in terms of usage, you could probably use that to analyze how a data source is being used and how different teams are using it. Now, if I was to publish that data source with a prompt for the user, it would actually ask that user for a username and login. They would log in and it would use their credentials. So it could use my Snowflake credentials manually every time I go and connect to the data. Let's go back into Tableau. And what we're going to do now is publish it again. We're going to overwrite the existing one. And I'm going to go to publish to server. And this time we're going to go through a couple of different mechanics. Okay, so you can see here that it now tells me that, look, you've already got a workbook published under this name. And the data source name is already in use. So we're going to keep that because we're just going to overwrite this. We don't really care too much about this. I'm going to add another tag and I'll say that this is a user prompt. It's a really long tag. You probably shouldn't add tags that long. And what I'll do is I'll go back in here to authentication and I'll ask it to prompt the user and go back out. And you can see that that changes to prompt the user. And then the last thing I'll do this time is I'll tick this box to update the workbook to use the published data source. So what this will do is as soon as I've published, it will change the connection back to the example that we saw on Tableau Online. So let's just do this now. And it will see that you'll get this notification saying, hey, a database is already in use. Hit yes. And it will take a bit of time. And you'll see here on the very top left-hand side, just watch the space over here on the left. Give it a second. It's thinking about it. And there you go. It's actually created a new data source for me. And then it's opened the tab to show me the published data source. Okay. So now you can see that everything is good. Everything is published. If I try and use this data source, it actually asks me to log in. Okay. So this is the prompt that it was asking for before. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and log into this just so you can just see that it's working. And we'll make sure that it works. And I can actually ask it to remember the password for me personally. So hit sign in. And now you can see we've got the same data source ready to go again. If I go back to the lineage, you'll see nothing has changed here. The 5 transynct field is still there. And this update field, remember earlier on we added some metadata to it. If I click on it, you'll see that that metadata has unfortunately disappeared because we overwrote it when we published. So that metadata is no longer there. Okay. Now what I can do is I can go ahead and write a new description. Hit save. And now this description is saved to the data source. If I go back here, you can see the description is right there. But also when I click on it, you can see that it's also there. Now, before I move on, I just want to show you something. If we go back to our workbook and we decide that we actually want to use the original connection, we still can. Just because it's switched them over doesn't mean we can't switch it back. So if we right click on this, you can see that it has a bunch of different things, okay? And you can see here there's an option to create a local copy. What that essentially does is it looks at the connection and creates a local version on your machine rather than using the published data source. If I create a local copy, you'll see that it asks me where to save it. And notice it has this option for TDS or TDSX. The very beginning of this video, I talked about Tableau file types. Check out my video on that if you haven't seen that yet. And of course, what you can now do is bring that file down. So I'll save it to my desktop. And what it does is it creates that local connection. And if we give it a second, you'll see that it creates a copy that is an exact duplicate of the original one. And then what you can do is if you want to switch back to the live connection locally on your machine rather than the published data source, is you can right click on this first one and select replace data source and replace it with your copy. And you'll see that Tableau will do a switcheroo on the data sources and it will switch the tick from the top one to the bottom one. And at that point, you've switched over. So essentially, you can publish something up. And if you're not happy, you content because you want to work on something locally, switch it back down and switch between the two data sources. So when you're done testing, as long as your two data sources are staying in tune, you can then sort of make sure everything stays in track. Now, I always say it's actually better to create a new workbook to publish up data sources and keep that workbook saved somewhere than it is to try and manage these two workbooks, these two data sources in the same workbook, because you just essentially forget what you're doing and it becomes a mess. Okay. Now for the next one, we're going to move a little bit faster. We're going to publish up an extract and see what's different about that. So let's go ahead and right click on this. Now, if I actually go back to the blog pages, this is an old Google Analytics data dump. So it's not 100% accurate, but it does have some sort of recent data because it's sort of a merge of two big data sets. So if I right click on this and we go to publish to server, you'll see that this time it's an extract. We are going to get a few more options. And the first thing here is you can see publish data sources is the folder that it's picked. So it's remembered the previous setting that we had before. It's taken the name from the data source again, which we expect. And we can say this is an extract. Okay. Now, the thing about this is as we go down this list, you can obviously do things like add more information and you've got some permissions. And it again picks it up from the folder. We don't need to do anything there. Now, the authentication, it says here refresh not enabled. And the reason it's saying this is because this is an extract. An extract is typically going to need a refresh because it's just a snapshot of the data. It's not going to update itself unless it's prompted to. So if I click on edit, you'll see that I get the same permissions window that I got before, the same connection window that I got before. And this time I have the option, instead of embedding the password, I have the ability to allow a refresh. Okay. And now that's done, I'm going to leave that there. And once we've done that, you'll see this option about Tableau Bridge. It says Tableau Bridge required for on-premise data. Essentially, it's basically saying to me that, hey, if I can't connect to this data because it's local to your business or in your organization, I'm going to need Tableau Bridge in order to do this. Now, I've actually done a separate video on how to set up Tableau Bridge. Check that out. But nonetheless, it's basically telling you, warning you that this is going to need this feature in the future. Now, we've also got this option to do the switcheroo, and we've got the same message here at the bottom to tell you that, hey, it's going to do a temporary connection test because it can see that the extract itself is using a live connection. So now let's go ahead and hit publish, and we're going to update this workbook to use the published data source again. So let's go hit publish. And now let's see what happens. It's typically going to open on the other screen, even though I've got the browser here. So let's wait and see what happens. You'll see that it pops up this second data source. It does the switcheroo, and then it eventually deletes this. If you just wait a while before we switch over, you'll see that it did it just as we switched over. So it deleted it, and now we have the three settings again, and we only have the local copy that we made before. If I go back to this tab, you'll see that this is now published. And here at the top, you can see that it says extract. Now I can actually switch it to a live connection right here from Tableau Server rather than having to do on desktop. But nonetheless, again, it's got the same settings and tabs. So connections, we've got a new one now for extract refreshes. And the reason this is here is because what we did on desktop is we allowed extract refreshes. Here is where we set them up. So I can go in here and I can set this up, and I can set this to maybe say hourly refresh. I can hit create every Thursday. That's fine. Hit create. And now you'll see that refresh schedule, that's a tongue twister, set up there. So it's ready to go. Now, if I go back to lineage, you get the exact same setup. So you get the information about the fields, the database it came from, the tables, and all the other information you might want to use. Okay, so that's pretty much it in terms of publishing data sources. I've sort of tried to go through it as thorough as I possibly can. There is one nice thing. If I go back to my published data sources folder, you'll see that I have the two data sources here, and one says extract, one says live. With live connections, you do get some enhanced ability new in 2021.3. Check out my video on this particular feature. But if I click on this little eye, you'll see that I have this option that gives me a bit more information about this data source. Now, if you've never done this before, you've probably not seen all the items here. So you have a bit of information about the data source that I recreated when I published it up. The location, the owner, and the data source tags. These were added when I was creating this data source. You've got the version history, and you've got a few more bits of information that you can use. Now, you can also give it a certification. Essentially, if I click Edit Certification Status, you can give this tick and say this data is certified, and you can say Tim has approved this data source. Okay. So now that we've done that, hit save. And not only will this data source now be certified, but you'll get a nice little badge on the data source to let you know that it's got this special status. Okay. Now, the other thing you can do when you hit this three dots, you do get some other setups and control about this. So you're able to go in and control this a little bit more and play around with it and essentially get this absolutely set up the correct way you want. You can edit the certification as well. You can remove it. You can preview how it looks. And you can even sort of play around with some formatting here. So you can see you can add links, bold, italics, images. All of this can be added to make this whole certification experience a little bit nicer. Okay, if I hit cancelled and I click on this, you'll see that that certification is also loaded there. So this is a nice thing to do. If you've got data sources that have got a lot of energy and time put into them and they're published data sources, this is a great way of telling people, hey, this data source should be used. This is a trusted data source and you should be trying to use this as much as you can. Now, that's pretty much it. This is a live connection, so this is all sort of set up. So that's pretty much it. I just wanted to show you that basic feature. If I go back to my published data source now, you can see that they're here. Now, we're not done yet because things can get even more complex. Sometimes, just sometimes, you're working in Desktop and you're connected to a published data source, but you want to protect yourself against the odd chance that, for example, Tableau Online goes down in your particular region. Let's say I'm in EU and the AWS instance in EU goes down, and suddenly, if that goes down, I actually lose my access to this data source. Every time I'm doing something here in Tableau, this connection here is actually calling out to the Tableau Online instance. So it's working over the internet. Now, if you're working in a very bad network environment, you might actually end up having a poor experience. So you can kind of do something a little bit crazy. You can actually take an extract of your published data source, whether it's a live connection or not. So essentially what we can do here is we can right click on this, go here, take an extract of our published data source, and it's just going to go ahead and create another extract of our published data source, which in itself was an extract of a live connection. So it's a little bit of a weird heritage there, but it actually does mean that you're able to keep working should the internet go down. You're able to just send this across a workbook, and then when you take the extract off, it's actually working off the live connection. So essentially what you're doing is you're pulling the data down to your computer from Tableau Online and working with it absolutely fine. But it can be a little bit of a tongue twister because essentially you can kind of lose track of where exactly you are. So if I right click on this and I go to create a local copy, if we think about this, you'll see that it gets a TDS and TDSX. Let's hit save. And when we go to create a local copy, you'll see that we get the original extract that we created. So you're thinking, well, what is that extract? So you'll right click on that and you'll say, don't use the extract, and you'll go to it and you'll think, oh, great. Now I'm going to get the database connection, and you'll see it gets the database connection. So when you basically do that process, you can end up being in this sort of maze of not really being sure what you're connected to, because you go from a published data source to an extract, create a local copy, and you're back to the original live connection, and you missed a step somewhere there, right? So just be super careful you don't get your knickers in a twist in this particular instance. Be always sure about what you're connecting to. If you right click on any data source, you can of course go to the properties and get a bit more information about what exactly you're connecting to and make sure it's correct. And just make sure you're not sort of getting yourself into this mess. I've got myself into a bit of a twist because I've taken an extract of an extract of an extract and then I've just lost my way. So be sure to check that out. But I think this video is long enough. Hopefully we've done a very decent guide on how to publish up a data source and how to get going. If you've got any additional questions about this, if you'd like to know more, if there's anything I didn't cover, if there's more you'd like me to cover, the comments is the best place for this. I'm actually going to be reading these and responding to them pretty much every single week. So be sure to flood the comments. Let me know what you'd like to see a video on, especially if it's about Tableau Server, and I'll catch you in the next video.